Louis came to rest over a landing pad. Once we landed, I pushed Bart and Dana out of the way as I hurried out the hatch. I was eager to see the house, having dreamed of it for so long. The home was on the other side of a small park which was the side yard. Mature maple and oak trees lined two sides of the park, shading it except for sunbeams falling through their branches. A barbecue was beside a picnic table and sitting at one corner beside the house. I remembered coming out in the evening with friends. I loved such dinners in the fall, gathering around grilling dinner when the leaves have turned red, brown, and golden as they fell from the trees. Despite this area being tropical, it still had a short cooler autumn season, a colorful one. Many of the trees dropped leaves into big mounds on the ground in the autumn. With exception of having to rake them up, they were great for throwing yourself headlong into a heaping pile, hoping you hadn't left the rake in an unfortunate place. Once we entered the park, I could see the house with its large bay windows facing us. From the corner of the landing pad a stone path led to a walking bridge in the middle, crossing a trickling creek. The path continued from the bridge kitty corner to the front of the house. The rest of the park was manicured grass with gardens scattered around. Several wooden benches with wrought iron accents were placed in perfect little settings throughout for sitting. We walked through the park, and through the front door. Once inside, I walked down a staircase to the living room. Finally, I was looking through those bay windows facing the park. I had dreamed of looking out and sleeping in front of these windows since I first thought of them. I imagined waking up to early morning sunbeams falling through the trees into the park. There were 7 windows that lined the outside wall. Each one was 20 feet high by 8 feet wide and divided by tall wooden columns. Each column reached to the ceiling and looked like a half arch. Every one of them was at least 2 feet wide and 6 feet deep, made of a single piece of carved wood. At the other end of the living room was another wall of windows, looking out over a bay, a tropical bay. A stone fireplace sat in the right corner against the wall just beyond the bay windows. The natural stonework went all the way to the ceiling. Next to it was a set of wooden framed French doors with large glass inserts leading out onto a stone patio with raised stone gardens on either side. The living room ceiling was at least 30 feet high and made of tongue and groove natural walnut, and the floor of the living room was polished natural fitted wooden planks with inlaid walnut. It had an overall reddish-brown tint. Several woven rugs were placed around the room. A couch and coffee table sat near the fireplace, facing the windows overlooking the bay. I often imagined myself sitting next to it looking out over the water, at sunset, into the night, with a fire lit. Another story with a loft was high on the left side of the living room, across from the windows facing the park. The kitchen and bedrooms were up on that level. The loft itself was 20 feet wide and ran the full length of the room. A 4-foot carved banister protected anyone from falling off. The loft was half dining, half sitting area. A table with 12 chairs sat outside the kitchen. The rest contained 3 couches, end tables, and several art displays. I remembered sitting up the reading and listening to music, for hours at a time. As I stood in front of the windows, I thought of the many details regarding this house, regarding Sierra. I knew many of the places and most of the people involved in my dreams. Yet, many memories of places, people, and things seemed to be coming from another place. Where they came from, I didn't have a clue, but my mind bathed in those new memories. They caused me anxiety, and stressed me out every time I remembered something new. As I stood there, I determined to accept whatever memories should come without continually freaking out. I realized I should let them be what they are, memories. Mine or someone else's didn't matter. I would have to get used to them, anyway. My home on the bay, in the little town of Somnolent, French for sleepy, was on the north shore of Clare Island. Clare Island was situated in a chain of islands, every one of which connected to one another and wrapped around the whole planet of commerce at the equator. My home there, although modest compared to the homes of many other inhabitants of Sierra, was a comfortable, relaxing home. I heard a knock at the door. It was Jack, not a vision this time, but Jack in person. "Hello, Jeff," he said as he grabbed my hand to shake it. I said, well, hello, Jack. What brings you this way? Then I asked rhetorically, is this another vision? He gave me a strange look, then replied, no. I came by to hang out. I thought I can be of some assistance, understanding your current condition. Apparently, he knew what was going on. Other than the obvious comment, I could tell by his demeanor. I said, you can assist for sure, but first I am starving. I recently fed my lunch to a bucket. So, I should eat. I was acting natural as if things were normal. Well, I was making an attempt at being normal. Just then, Dana came walking down the stairs. She asked what we wanted to eat. I said to surprise us. She returned up the stairs into the kitchen. Bart brought out a small table with 2 chairs and set them on the patio. Afterward, Dana came walking through the room carrying 2 plates of food, with 2 sodas, and set them on the table. Dana had prepared steaks for the both of us. We sat outside to eat. I said, after my first couple of bites, being impressed, this is the best steak I have ever eaten. As I recalled another memory, I realized it wasn't real meat. No one ate meat any longer. Well, no one killed and ate animals any longer. Farmers grew meat like one grows strawberries, cucumbers, or watermelons. Scientists developed a seed called mDNA seeds. They feed the seeds to all the different animals. Once inside, the seeds copied the DNA of different selections of flesh from each animal. One seed might pick up the backstrap, another, the tenderloin, or the ribs, etc. Then, the seeds turned a specific color based on whatever part of the animal they reproduced. After the animal passed them, the farmers would collect the seeds and clean them. Once cleaned, they planted the seeds and grew specific cuts targeted within the individual animal. No one could tell the difference. In fact, the meat produced from the new method tastes many times better than the meat produced the old-fashioned method. Although, the plants those seeds produced were some strange-looking plants. I told Jack, I love meat. Me too, and I love that seed time and harvest are now the proper order of things regarding all meat, he said. Then, I asked Jack about the memories and why I was having them. I am flooded with memories that are not mine, and they seem to be random. I have memories of some things and others things come as a surprise as if it were the first time I have experienced them. Do you know why that is? Not really, Jeff. What kinds of things are you remembering or what memories are flooding your head? He asked. Well, when we pulled up to the yard, I remembered having BBQs in the small park beside the house, with friends in the fall. I saw some of those faces in my mind, yet I didn't recall their names. I remembered the leaves falling and how I raked them into colorful heaps. It felt like I had lived here for ages. As we were just discussing, I remembered all about meat farming as we were eating, and cedar. I knew the meat came from cedar. I had thoughts of Sierra itself, ones I had not considered before. I knew they were true, just different things coming into my mind. Again, many of which I have never thought of before coming here. I wish I had an answer for you, Jeff, but I don't. I will give it some thought, and I am sure we will figure it out. At first they bothered me. Now, I am working on accepting them without falling apart. I figured they had something to do with why I am here. Neither one of us said any more about it, but I knew this was a conversation we would have again. Then, changing the subject, I mentioned to Jack, I wonder what cedar is like this time of year. Just like anywhere else, he replied. I guess it depends on where on cedar you are referring to. Cedar was the agricultural planet of the system. It's called cedar because of the gigantic cedar trees which grow in the forest there. The trees are at least 40 feet in diameter and stand 200 to 300 feet tall, with the most colorful wood. The columns between the windows and the flooring in the living room are from those cedar trees, and the wood grain itself comes in shades of deep blue to blood red. Loggers cut them at 2 feet from the base where a dark brown natural line formed, which was how the loggers knew a tree was ready to harvest. After cutting, trained loggers looked for a small indent in the middle of the stump where they placed a seed from that same tree. The seed grew out from the center to the edge of the bark and then shot up to 300 feet high. It was only a 10-year process at which time the tree was ready to harvest again. Loggers who logged the trees traveled from place to place harvesting them. There were several hundred groups of loggers. Each group developed a 10-year rotation with harvest plan which brought them back to an area every 10 years. Many of the loggers were men who did similar work back on Earth in the day. I guess once logging is in one's blood, it's hard to do anything else. When asked, every logger would tell you their favorite place, without reservation, would be in the dense forest surrounded by the smell of fresh-cut trees. Each logging crew consisted of at least 100 men, both men and AI, called specials. The human side of a crew could be as few as 2 men, up to 75. The rest of the 100-man crew comprised specials. I thought it interesting that each crew used a specific model of AI, special. Those specials looked like hefty men who stood 9 feet tall with enormous beards and bald heads. The humans said the model was perfect for working in the forest. Loggers, along with their families, generally lived in tents, traveling around cedar, harvesting the trees. Some of them built cabins in harvest areas for when they returned, but most lived in the tents. It was amusing as each tent appeared bigger on the inside. Everyone had a place in Sierra, heaven. One group of people preferred living one way. Another group preferred living another way. I could not imagine living as the loggers do. Yet, many of the loggers would live no other way. Life had become more desirable to be content than to be important. Yet, everybody was important in God's kingdom. I recalled a memory, whether true, whenever I came across a group of these loggers, I had a wonderful time laughing at their dumb jokes, along with them, for hours. I could only recall good things about each one. They are among the most gracious people in Sierra. You could always tell when they were in the area by the enormous transportation vehicles hovering over a logging site, large craft with cranes to hoist fresh-cut timber onto its deck. It was a tremendous operation. The craft looked like oversized airborne barges, each able to hold up to 100 of the large logs. Once the barge filled up, it hauled the timber off to the different sawmills, or pulp mills depending on the end products needed. Several mills could cut the cedars into sizable cants. A construction project might use cants up to 20 by 20 by 200 feet long. If there were no orders for the cants, they delivered them to different mills to cut them into smaller size domestic cuts for buildings, furniture, paneling, etc. Each mill cut several billion board feet annually. Log mills cut hundreds of different varieties of wood, such as walnut, pine, birch, along with others rivaling the beauty of the cedar trees. Without comparison, the cedars are the largest, most plentiful trees on cedar, which made them significant. So, cedar was an appropriate name for the planet. Even though the cedars were significant, there was a larger tree than the cedar tree, called redwoods. Redwood trees grew on the Moon Guvu, along the Hassan River, and the planet Mosswood along the Green Coast. A redwood often had a circumference up to 150 feet and stood up to 500 feet tall. The Green Coast redwoods were cut and milled on the planet Mosswood only. They are not as plentiful as the cedar tree. Redwood trees were only used to build within certain areas where the climate was predominantly wet and cold. The ones on Guvu were not harvested. Now, the planet cedar also includes all their major farms and ranches in Sierra. In the beginning, when humans first settled Sierra, various kinds of special AI along with the messengers built houses, barns, and outbuildings. Afterward they continued to develop the land for farming and raising livestock. Then, another type of AI called companions maintained them until people could take over, helping them to ease into life here in Sierra. As planned, the inhabitants eventually took over and fended for themselves. I said to Jack, I perceive it is not the early years here in Sierra. What is the date? The year is M206, he answered. Jack looked at me and mentioned, I read the notebook. I know you have been to several time periods covering different events in history. Well, history for me, future for you. This is where you landed. So, it is the time frame you will be experiencing. Sierra is operating at full force, peak capacity. It will do so for another 794 years. Then, he explained, you and I are two of the leaders for Sierra. You are first in command. I am one of two of your assistants, but in your current state you cannot fulfill your duties. I responded, okay, thanks. You read the book, huh? Jack didn't answer as I looked down at my meal contemplating. When I lifted my head, we were sitting at the table in the middle of an expansive wheat field under a large old oak tree. Golden wheat flowed into a deep blue sky in every direction. Jack shouted, "You asked about Cedar. Well, welcome to Cedar. You will have come here a million times, but I'm certain it is all new to you now. Farms here can be the size of a small country, and then there are those small family 10-acre farms." I was more interested in why popping around didn't make me sick. Unlike when leaving academy, I felt fine. Jack stood up as he waved his arms around. "I love it," he shouted. I stood up because I felt compelled to walk out into the field. Both of us walked out into the wheat field. I turned back to look at the oak tree only to see two raccoons stealing my dinner. Where did they come from? The little monsters grabbed my steak and took off up the tree with, what is now, their dinner. Jack, seeing the same thing, looked at me and said, "Well, you snooze, you lose. Raccoons are the consummate little bandits, aren't they?" He laughed. I laughed. We started back towards the tree to our dinner when I transported to the front door of a small stucco single-story home. The cottage was painted white with an unusual front door and windows on either side, each one rounded at the top. A small circular stained glass window was a foot above the door. The frames of the door, the windows, and the gutters were painted hunter green. Vegetation grew up at both corners of the house. The front yard was bordered by the thick covering of those same shrubs and trees lining both sides and hovered over most of the yard. I could only see a small sliver of blue sky above, down the middle. The yard extended 75 feet out from the front of the house and ended at an ocean. I observed several islands with mountains not too far away across the water. The sun was setting right between two of the islands. Nothing but the horizon could hide it. It reminded me of the inland waters of southeast Alaska, but warm and tropical. Each side of the yard had long tables placed next to the vegetation, every table set for a picnic. Several kinds of bowls with fruit, salads, and drinks sat in the center of each table. Apparently someone was having a barbecue in their front yard. Because the sun was setting, the whole scene appeared golden from its light. The yard was warm with a cool breeze meandering up from the water. I looked down and noticed I was wearing the chef's apron. I guess I was having the barbecue. A little to the right of me was a lit grill with one steak cooking. I said to myself, only one. As I looked around, I remembered the times I had dreamed of this place. I had dreamed of it even before my coming here. Often, I saw myself in other places. All of them felt real. It used to bother me. Perhaps, it might have been an out-of-body experience. It troubled me. It might include an orchard, a garden, a beach, or any place seen in my mind. I sensed the elements of each place. For example, if it were an orchard, I would smell the fruit, the damp earth, the trees, the coolness, etc. These experiences were mind-bending, powerful events. I often wondered if they could be real places. Was I seeing something supernatural? I knew this small house and yard to be one of those places. I remember seeing my family coming to this house for a barbecue. I looked around and took note the chairs were empty. Standing there by myself, I imagined my children, how this place was for them, how Sierra was for them, how heaven was for them, how it would be forever. I had a horrible thought and said out loud, how can heaven be so wonderful if any one child or grandchild were not here to share it with me? How can that be? I remembered reading in the Bible where God said He'd wipe away all of our tears. I couldn't understand what that meant at the moment. How would my tears be quenched if I lose even one child? My tears would be inconsolable. I looked again at the tables with their empty seats. A heartfelt sadness came over me as I filled each one with a face, young innocent children. I called out to God for each vacant setting at the table. I wasn't sure how to deal with the emotions, which overwhelmed me. It seemed like I stuck around for the better part of a day, spending most of that time interceding and praying. I understood heaven is the only place where we can find that which truly matters, everything else is secondary. I gained a sense of hope as I calmed down, knowing God feels the same way I do, even more so. Afterward, I turned to look at the burning meat. As I walked over to the barbecue, I tripped only to find myself on the ground of the patio, which lent itself to my frustration. I didn't even comment on the fact of being tired of falling on my face. Apparently, I was at the little cottage for only a moment. How could that be possible? I picked myself up saying nothing and walked over to the end of the patio to look out over the ocean, a tear still in my eye. I stood there for a while. No one bothered me. Jack went inside to leave me to myself. My thoughts turned to the sunset, how stunning it looked, like a painting as the sky fading from dark blue to a yellow-orange setting sun. Silver and pinkish clouds floated near the horizon. The distinct outlines of 3 moons were rising into the night sky. All of it reflecting on the ocean, which faded magically from light green to bluish gray. I gathered myself, walked back inside, noticing the sunlight coming through the windows, golden yellow. It felt soothing. I took comfort in its warmth. Jack and I talked for a while. We talked about my, more than interesting, adventure up to that point. I bragged about the fishing on the lake. Finally, Jack said, "You might need sleep, Jeff. I bet you still like to sleep. I assumed you have had a couple exciting days. Tomorrow, we can walk into town. I'll show you what drew you to live here in Somnolent." So, I walked him to the front door to say a proper goodbye. As I turned around to go back down the stairway, I saw Dana putting the finishing touches on a bed placed in front of one window overlooking the park. It was still early evening. Yet, I walked over and lay down. I meditated for a while concerning all I had been through. Before too long, I fell asleep through. Before too long, I fell asleep through. Before too long, I fell asleep through.